Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's keep Series 9 and Week 68 going with today's Tolkien Tuesday. Now, last week, we finished looking at the treasure trove that is Letter 211 to Rona Bear. And of course, that means we're going to go straight to Letter 212. It's a draft continuation of Letter 211 to Rona Bear, so it goes on as though there were no break. Tolkien acknowledges he's already written quite a bit, and so he decides to add a few lines about the underlying framework. What he says is the myth on which all is founded, in the hopes that it might make possible a better understanding of the relationships between Valar, elves, men, and so on. And I have to tell you, this is such a wonderful basic explanation that I actually refer to this more often than I do the lengthier explanation in the famous Letter 131. Tolkien writes here, "The Valar, or powers rulers, were the first creation, rational spirits, or minds without incarnation, created before the physical world." He then explains parenthetically that they're actually Ainur, and the Valar are the great ones that came into the world, just like we talked about on last week's Word Nerd Wednesday. I also love the distinction he makes between the Valar and gods that he puts in little quotes, explaining that they only take the imaginative, not the theological place of gods. And he goes on, "The Ainur took part in the making of the world as sub-creators, in various degrees after this fashion. They interpreted according to their powers and completed in detail the design propounded to them by the One. This was propounded first in musical or abstract form, and then in an historical vision. In the first interpretation, the vast music of the Ainur, Melkor introduced alterations, not interpretations of the mind of the One, and great discord arose. The One then presented this music, including the apparent discords, as a visible history." And I love that. This is such a brilliant summary of the Ainulindale, and I highly recommend using this as a way to explain it to people who struggle with understanding some of those really complex metaphysical elements. Tolkien goes on, talks about converting this music from a visible history to reality. He writes, "At this stage, it had still only a validity to which the validity of a story among ourselves may be compared. It exists in the mind of the teller and derivatively in the minds of the hearers, but not on the same plane as the teller or hearers. In other words, at this point, it's just an idea of the One that can be understood by the Ainur, but not experienced by any of them. It's not a physical thing that can be touched or seen. Yet." So Tolkien continues, "When the One, the teller, said, 'Let it be,' then the tale became history, on the same plane as the hearers, and these could, if they desired, enter into it." Or remember that Ea means it is. So that's why the created universe is called Ea by the elves. And yes, he continues, some of those Ainur entered into the world, and they're now a part of it until its completion. Those are the Valar and the Maiar that we began talking about last Wednesday. Then we get a wonderful explanation of the whole raiment thing of the Ainur. Tolkien explaining, "It was because of their love of Ea and because of the part they had played in its making that they wished to and could incarnate themselves in visible physical forms, though these were comparable to our clothes, insofar as our clothes are a personal expression, not to our bodies. Their forms were thus expressions of their persons, powers, and loves." But man, Tolkien just keeps going, shining a bright light on the early stages of the Silmarillion, a book which, keep in mind, would not be published for nearly 20 years after this letter was written. He writes, "Elves and men were called the children of God, because they were, so to speak, a private addition to the design by the Creator, and one in which the Valar had no part. Their themes were introduced into the music by the One when the discords of Melkor arose." I really love that, because it puts this line from Ainulindale into perspective. "And behold, a third theme grew amid the confusion, and it was unlike the others. For it seemed at first soft and sweet, a mere rippling of gentle sounds and delicate melodies. But it could not be quenched, and it took to itself power and profundity. And it seemed at last that there were two musics progressing at one time before the seat of Iluvatar, and they were utterly at variance. The one was deep and wide and beautiful, but slow and blended with an immeasurable sorrow, from which its beauty chiefly came. And that is us, folks. A powerful and unquenchable melody with immeasurable sorrow that is the chief source of our beauty. So these Valar knew that we'd all be coming, but because they had no part in our design, Tolkien says they knew little of our nature. And because of that lack of knowledge, quote, their foresight, derived from their pre-knowledge of the design, was imperfect or failed in the matter of the deeds of the children. But that mystery also fit in admiration or love. Tolkien explains that they yearned for the children before they came and loved them afterwards as creatures other than themselves, independent of them and their artistry. Children as being weaker and more ignorant than the Valar, but of equal lineage, deriving being direct from the one, even though under their authority as rulers of Arda. Elves and men are not only of equal lineage with each other, but they're of equal lineage with the Valar, and that is not something we talk about often enough. But of course, that's the good guys. Melkor sees elves and men in a different light. Tolkien writes, the corrupted, as was Melkor Morgoth and his followers, of whom Sauron was one of the chief, saw in them, that would be men and elves, the ideal material for subjects and slaves, to whom they could become masters and gods, envying the children, and secretly hating them, in proportion as they became rebels against the One, and Manwë his lieutenant in Ea. Well, that explains how much Morgoth hated Feanor, and how much Sauron hated Elendil, doesn't it? And then Tolkien shifts to talk about one of the other confusing bits, the supposed immortality of the elves and the mortality of men. He writes, in this mythical prehistory, immortality, strictly longevity coextensive with the life of Arda, was part of the given nature of the elves. Beyond the end, nothing was revealed. And he contrasts that then with men's fate, saying, mortality, that is, a short lifespan, having no relation to the life of Arda, is spoken of as the given nature of men. The elves called it the gift of Ilúvatar, God. Okay, all well and good. We've understood this from a number of places. But Tolkien continues, it must be remembered that mythically these tales are elf-centered, not anthropocentric, and men only appear in them at what must be a point long after their coming. This is therefore an elvish view. Well, we've talked about before how elves see men's death as a gift, but men struggle with that. And Tolkien continues, explaining this elvish view, quote, does not necessarily have anything to say for or against such beliefs as the Christian view that death is not part of human nature, but a punishment for sin, rebellion, a result of the fall. Instead, Tolkien writes that it should be regarded as an elvish perception of what death, not being tied to the circles of the world, should now become for men, however it arose. And later he says, are you listening there, Farazan? To attempt by device or magic to recover longevity is thus a supreme folly and wickedness of mortals. Longevity, or counterfeit immortality, true immortality is beyond Ea, is the chief bait of Sauron. It leads the small to a golem, and the great to a ringwraith. Think about that for a minute. And for now, folks, this wraps up this week's Tolkien Tuesday. Be sure to join me again next week when Tolkien gives us a really helpful insight into Miriel, Feanor's mother, and a glimpse into the creation of the dwarves by Aule. In the meantime, please visit patreon.com/TolkienTimes to learn how you can join the Content Council and be a part of deciding what I talk about each series. You can also support the show, get an ad-free feed and bonus episode every week. Join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Word Nerd Wednesday. If you're watching this on YouTube, you know the drill. Please like and subscribe. Follow or subscribe in your podcast apps and follow @Tolkien Times on social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.